The following program is brought to you by the University of Alabama.
Joan McBreen has achieved considerable success as a poet in Ireland with her collections of lyrics, such as Winter in the Eye and Heather Island, evoking childhood memories of family life, the natural beauty of the Irish countryside, and the experience of being a wife, mother, and poet. In 1999, McBreen astounded the Irish literary community with The White Page, her anthology of contemporary women poets. Who knew they were there? And followed this with an anthology of younger Irish poets, The Watchful Heart. It's not all William Butler Yeats, you know. I spoke with Joan McBreen at the Alabama Booksmith in Homewood, Alabama. Joan, it's so nice to see you again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, John. It's good to see you too. I'm glad to be back here in Alabama.
You're back for your second Alabama poetry tour.
That's true. I came in 2010 and I had a wonderful time and visited many of the universities across the state.
This time you did, I'm told, you did 5 poetry readings in 2.5 days.
That's exactly right, 2.5 days.
All over the Birmingham area.
Well, 4 in the Birmingham area and 1 yesterday in Montevallo. So that was the only out of the city.
Nice
reading.
Little campus.
Lovely campus.
Isn't that a pretty little place?
And lovely place.
Yeah, they make a person feel very comfortable and welcome in Montevallo.
Indeed.
Always liked it there. This, well, you keep this up, Joan. You'll be the poet laureate of Alabama before County Galway.
Well, I'm so happy to be back here, both myself and my husband Joe, and we feel that I'm not just back here to give the poetry readings, but I'm also back here to be among the friends like yourself and your wife Jennifer Horn, and my friends Sam and Sandra Spraybury and her husband Sam, who all of you have been to Ireland, and we've had good times there, so it's lovely to be back here in Alabama and repeating the good times under your blue sunny skies.
Yeah, we're having good weather right now.
Yes, it's really lovely.
It's often enough to melt an Irish person. But
well,
today
yes,
it's
indeed.
pretty okay.
Last time we were here, it was 100 degrees, and it was not pleasant for us.
This, speaking of pleasant, this is in a sense unpleasant, but the Irish, you particularly, the Irish poetry community, Ireland in general, has just suffered a terrific loss with the death of Seamus Heaney. And I'm very interested in how that was a national event. That was an event of national mourning, was it not?
Absolutely. The morning his death was announced on the media, on radio and on television around 10 a.m. on Friday morning, the 30th of August, the entire country went into mourning for one person, for one human being, for one wonderful poet. And in fact, as we speak, I would go so far as to say the country is still reeling at the loss of this wonderful poet laureate whom we all loved so much. And we really have not absorbed the fact that he is gone.
It's amazing. This is utter speculation, but I actually have been thinking to myself, if Richard Wilbur died, if Billy Collins died, or someone like Robert Frost did die, I don't think that we'd have the same national sense of loss. The poetry community certainly would, but I think poetry is in the weave of the Irish culture.
Well, I certainly agree with you that poetry is highly regarded. For example, even the president of our country, Michael D. Higgins, is also a poet and had been a very close friend of Seamus Heaney's. I think the fact that Seamus endeared himself to the man on the street as much as he endeared himself to his fellow poets in Ireland and abroad. Seamus spent, for example, 32 years coming over and back here to the United States, you know, to universities right across the States, and of course elsewhere in the world, so that the morning when it began in Ireland on the day of his death, with modern technology, the emailing and Twitter and Facebook, you know, it became an international sense of mourning. And since I've come over here to the United States, I've spoken to so many people about it, and in fact I dedicated each of my 5 readings under the Bach series of visiting writers here in Alabama to the memory of Seamus Heaney, and I've used some of his poetry which I had with me on a CD, and I played some of the poems accompanied by the music of the wonderful Irish piper Liam O'Flynn. And in many ways, I felt myself back in that church in Donnybrook at his funeral mass each time I played the music and the poetry from that tape.
Well, that's painful. I mean, I think
yes,
there's
it was.
a certain amount of
yes,
pain
it was.
in this.
It was for me personally, because of all of that. And I stood over the fact that my readings did have an elegiac tone to them. I was prepared to suffer the emotional strain of doing all that, because I just simply felt I owed it to Seamus.
That's wonderful. In my reading, pretty skimpy, but some reading of Irish history, I keep coming across the role of the poet in relation to the kings. Back, not prehistoric, but 1,000 and more years ago, where poets were in the court of the king, right up as a chief advisor, with a long apprenticeship. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, the poet back all those centuries would have been employed by the kings of Ireland, the high kings, and they would be their job was to comment in poetic terms on the politics of the time, on the gossip of the time, to bring the news as the bees in the field of the high kings, to bring the news of the environment, of the population, to the attention of the king, who in turn would share it with his courtiers. So, if you like, the filler or the poet was a very, very important person in olden times, in ancient Ireland.
Yeah, I think that whether people are aware of it at the highest level of consciousness or not, that tradition has hung on. So the Irish have a higher opinion of the importance of poets than maybe other cultures do.
I also think because the country is so small and there are so many, many poets, not all of them published poets, but poets who will carry around in their heads all the poetry that they learned by heart as children at school, particularly at primary school, at national school, as we would say in Ireland. And because the poetry is shared, particularly in social gatherings. For example, in Ireland, when we gather at funerals, at weddings, when we gather in the pub, inevitably the conversation will turn to poetry and singing. And one is not really part of the shared experience of being together unless one can hand on the request to the next person. And now, what are you going to share with us? What poem have you for us? What song have you for us? So that's how it is.
These poets, the old bards who were advisors to the kings, they did not have 6 children, but they did not have a spouse and 6 children. You have carved out, made in Ireland and now internationally, a career in poetry at the same time that you raised a great family, half of which is in America now. Of your 6 children, 3 are here?
Two of our 6 children married Americans and are living in Chicago. And between my son, our second son, and our daughter, they have given us 5 granddaughters. Our daughter actually married our second son's best friend, and they had met in the Chicago Board of Trade 18, 19 years ago. So my daughter's husband is actually Irish American, but he grew up and was educated in Chicago.
Yeah. This reading some of your essays, there is a moment in your life when you were the mother of 6 small children, couldn't get a babysitter one day, had ambitions, writing ambitions of your own, and you went to this all-important meeting with Yvonne Boland.
Yes.
And what this is, she was even then a well-known writer.
At the point of my life when I had encountered the work of Yvonne Boland, I was having and rearing these 6 small children, and I also had a full-time teaching job. But as you say, Don, I did have aspirations of my own to write, but I just simply could not figure out a way around the problem of the 6 children and the very, very busy husband who was working in Irish industry. I just simply couldn't figure out a way how I could do it. And it used to puzzle me, how did somebody like Yvonne Boland, who was my age actually, and had 2 small daughters of her own, how she had managed to, at that point, have at least three published collections. So on this particular day, she came to give a reading in Galway, and I'm there with no babysitter, and my youngest child was literally a baby in arms. I'm surrounded by them. I'm in a fury because I wanted to do nothing else but go to hear Yvonne Boland read in a town 20 miles down the road. So in desperation, and this was now long before the time of seat belts and car seats and booster seats, I piled the whole lot of them into a small battered yellow Volkswagen and drove myself and themselves into Galway. When I got there, I sat at the back of the room, and I was very shy and nervous and embarrassed to be sitting with my clutch. And the reading was wonderful. And at the end of the reading, I had 3 of her books with me, and I said to my daughter Sarah, who at that point was about 8.5, I said, "Sarah, would you go up and ask the lady to sign these books?" So Sarah trotted up with the books to Yvonne, and she said, my mammy wants to know, will you sign these books, please? And Yvonne said, "Well, where's your mammy?" And Sarah said, she's over there with the rest of them and the baby. And Yvonne beckoned me up, and very nervously I walked up towards her and I stood in front of her, and she said, "I'm delighted you've come to my reading." And I said, "Well, I've been admiring your work since you first published, and this was my opportunity to meet you." And I said to her, I do have a question for you." And she looked at me quite puzzled, and I said, "Yvonne, how can you be a mother and a poet?" And all of a sudden, to my utter consternation, the tears came into her eyes, and she just sort of turned away and walked away a little bit, looking back on it, I think, in order to compose herself. And she came back over to me, and she said, "I'll be giving a series of workshops at the Irish Writers' Centre in Dublin this winter. Would you like to come and join some other people and be part of my workshop?" And that's how my relationship with her started. And she became a huge, huge influence on me as a woman poet. And I did manage over the next number of years to figure out a way to begin to write and publish my own poems, with her help, I should add. And indeed, she spread herself at that time very, very widely over Ireland, over writing groups right across the whole country, and she gave of herself so generously that she managed to put the names of many women, writers and poets, on the map. In the last couple of decades, Ivan in many ways has been Ireland's loss and America's gain, in that she's been working for all this time over here at Stanford University.
Well, you've published a number of volumes of poetry, but you also are well known as an anthologist with two anthologies that have really made a difference in Ireland. One on younger and lesser known poets, and the White Page, an anthology of poetry by women. How many women in that book?
There are 113, the work of 113 women.
113
included.
Irish female poets.
Yes.
Who knew there were 113 Irish female poets?
At the time I started to do this research, I had returned to University College Dublin to do an MA in Women's Studies, and I chose for my thesis topic to research the Irish women poets of the 20th century. And when I had completed my degree, I was talked into considering bringing my thesis out as a book by my supervisors, by the head of the department, Alva Smith, and by the historian, Dr. Margaret McCurtain. So I thought about it for quite a long time, and there was a lot of other things going on in my life at that time. But in any event, some light came on in my head, and I decided, right, this is really important work. This must be done. The work of these women must be recorded, and it must be shared with the world. It took the most of 3 years, if not more, of my life, but I was very, very glad that I did it, and it's now about to go in. This book is about to go into its 5th reprint.
I know it is. It's a book that not only has it had legs, but it's been important. I think the conception before, in most people's minds, was that Irish poets are male, that they are William Butler Yeats and Seamus Heaney and Paul Muldoon and 24 others. But of course that's not the case. But let me ask you about something I'm curious about. You have the great poets, you have the great oaks of people like Yeats and Heaney. Does their stature inspire young poets, or does the shade that these giant trees cast, in a sense, inhibit young poets, or neither or both?
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this question, particularly since the death of Heaney. In the decades and the years following the death of Yeats, the poets, and most of them, if not all of them, were male. The shadow of Yeats fell over them, and they had a very hard time. And I'm thinking here of poets like Pádraig Fallon, F.R. Higgins, Thomas McGreevy, W.R. Rogers. In the 2-3 decades immediately following the death of W.B. Yeats in 1939, they had a hard time. It's not that they weren't publishing, but their work was totally overshadowed. They were not exactly considered second-rate, but they weren't considered important. And it's only actually in the last 2 decades that the work of these men I've named and others has come back into prominence because of the work of scholars like Patricia Coughlin at University College Cork, who has worked extensively, for example, on the work of Thomas McGreevy and on others. The question in terms of the shadow of Heaney, it's far too soon to assess. Sure. But apart from that altogether, I do not think that from the very beginning, Heaney's work and his presence as somebody who was obviously going to be a new master in contemporary Irish poetry, it was never going to inhibit poets of his generation, or indeed younger poets, and I believe that was because of his personality. Uh-huh. He had just a generous, loving, giving personality. He wanted to encourage younger poets. He wanted to talk to them. He made time for them, both here in the United States, as you know, and certainly in Ireland. And there are many, many, many people who have in their possession letters, they have memories of actual telephone calls that Seamus Heaney made to them in response to work that they would have published in maybe even a single poem that he would have admired. I mean, he was just extraordinary. So there is absolutely no sense, and there has not been any sense of the situation that the people who came after Yeats experienced.
Isn't it interesting that they're so
it's
different?
It's very interesting.
Your own work, I think of it as the poetry, I think of it as lyrical, I think of it as the poetry of nature and of family and close family. You have poems about your father, for example. Mm-hmm. And I'd like very much if you could take a couple, 3, and introduce them briefly and telling us what we might need to know. I don't know what we need to know, and then read them. This first one is what?
I'm very happy to share this poem. It's called Wild Woodbine. And I should tell you before I read the poem that my father was a ship's engineer. He was a merchant seaman. And as children growing up in Sligo, my mother raised us by and large as a single parent. We saw my father usually no more than twice a year. He worked for Irish Shipping. He was one of the people with many, many other seamen who helped keep the country afloat, actually, in the years after the war. You know, ships like the Irish Pine, the Irish Oak, over and back to places like Saskatchewan and Canada, you know, bringing the corn back and so on. But his presence in my house, the house I grew up in Quay Street in Sligo, was always there because of the photographs. And of course my mother talking about him, and the letters coming with these exotic stamps from all over the world. My geography was very good, actually, because of my father. Wild Woodbine. Wild Woodbine was beyond my reach in the thick hedges round Lough Gill. The heavy scent filled the house for days when my father brought it in, and it stayed fresh far longer than meadowsweet. Because I loved the delicate pink and white wild rose, he picked it too, cursing the thorns, muttering, "It dies too soon, you'd be better leaving it alone." Yet once, when my mother swept its petals from the floor, I saw him rescue one and place it carefully in the small wallet where he kept her photograph.
You're a poet of nature and family, and here you have a poem of nature and family. And what's the next one?
The next one actually was one of the first poems I brought to that workshop I mentioned earlier in my chat with you at the Irish Writers' Centre. This is one of the first poems I brought to Ivan, and it was subsequently published by my publisher, Jessie Lendenny, who still remains my publisher at Salmon Publishing. My father. My father was a lonely man whose 50 years at sea had left no deeper blue in his eyes. Once in spring at Lissadell, he picked bluebells from my mother, and his eyes looked different. He fought death a frightened man, hauled to unknown rocks from an ocean he could not navigate. I wonder nights now what lonely bay he sails in, and does he quote his lines of Yeats, and smoke his pipe, and drink the whiskey for the pain.
That's a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
Lissadell is it's an icon. It's a destination. It's one of the places in the West, and you have a poem particularly about it.
I do, and before I read this poem, I would just like to tell you that the purser, the name purser, in the text of this poem is a reference to the very famous woman Irish painter, Sarah Purser, who painted the magnificent portrait of Constance and Eva Gore Booth. And not always, but sometimes this portrait hangs in the Merrion Hotel, which is just opposite government buildings in Dublin. Winter light at Lissadell. Trees are the same as in my childhood, oaks, rowans and silver birch. Winter light is still shining over water, bent grass and Knocknarea. But the people I knew are gone. Pursers, Constance and Eva stare out from a canvas. The ghosts of my parents pick bluebells at Lissadell. Clouds lift over Ben Bulben. Other children run across the great lawns and through the house. Their cries echo an earlier splendour. The light, the weather, now.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope it's not very long before you and I are there.
Oh, it would be wonderful to have you back in Sligo, and we missed you very much last year. We missed both you and Jennifer.
You're a hard-working writer, especially now that all your children are grown. And so I often ask guests, we only have a few seconds, what is your next project? What are you working on now?
My next project is a big one. I'm about to make a new CD, a combination of my own poetry in collaboration with the music of a classical guitarist and composer called Glenn Austin, and a quartet of musicians from Galway. That's the big project for the coming months. And the other ongoing project is my work towards a new collection. It's going slowly, and at the moment the working title for the CD is The Iris Garden, and the working title for the collection, the new collection, is The Stone Jug.
All right. Well, your readers and listeners are looking forward to it. Joan, thank you very much. This has been a delight.
Well, thank you so much for having me here in Alabama, and it's been wonderful to talk to you this morning.
To order this season of Bookmark on DVD, call 1-800-463-8825. Additional information can be found on our website at www.alabamatv.org.